Hey, it's James. Welcome to the latest episode of the Inversiverse, the myth of sanity, madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Sanity, a word so casually used, yet so deeply loaded. It implies order, rationality, normality, but beneath the surface lies a weaponized tool of control, a fragile consensus, a story rarely questioned. In this episode of the Inversiverse, we step beyond the clinical and cultural definitions of mental health to explore a far more nuanced and often uncomfortable truth. We will examine how the concept of sanity has been shaped not just by medicine, but by power, politics, and cultural myth. From the genius cast as mad, to the rebel silenced as insane, to the neurodivergent minds pathologized by systems they never consented to, we interrogate how society defines, fears, and suppresses alternative perception. This journey will also take us into the mystic and metaphysical, exploring spiritual emergencies mistaken for psychosis, and how cultural viewed so-called madness as initiation into deeper wisdom. We'll question whether breakdown is always a pathology or sometimes a breakthrough. As always in Inversiverse, we aim not to give answers but to open doors, to challenge what we've inherited, and to invite you to consider, if sanity is a myth, then what lies beyond it. Section 1. Cracks in the mirror. What is sanity, and who gets to decide? Definition of sanity is conventionally defined as the state of having sound mental health or rationality. But historically, this definition shifts based on who holds cultural, religious, or political power. The mirror is a metaphor not just for self-reflection, but for how we interpret the world. Each shard represents a different framework of reality: cultural, spiritual, neurological, and emotional. Some reflections are dismissed as delusion, while others are upheld as truth. In a world built on consensus illusions, perhaps the mad are merely those who see what others can't or won't. I ask, but what if the mirror itself is a lie? What if what we call clarity is simply the majority agreeing to blur the same way? An example from modern times is how, when the majority of countries are aligned with left-leaning ideologies and democratic systems, left-wing political parties often label right-wing believers as crazy, mentally ill, troublemakers, insensitive, inconsiderate, insane, or conspiracy theorists, simply for not aligning with their views. And similar occurs the left. A key example occurred before the November 2024 election in the US. Democrat candidate Harris and Joe Biden openly hailed and labelled Trump as Hitler. This was also a classic case of projection. Individuals are frequently dismissed as stupid or as if there must be something inherently wrong. The right also do this to the left. It's all about division. Emotional reactions, anger, frustration, and the inability to regulate responses often emerge when others refuse to submit to a particular worldwide or perceived need for control over reality. In my view, neither political side offers a truly healthy framework for people. Both represent ideological constructs designed to divide. People often choose to align with one side or the other, not through reasoned conviction, but due to social pressures, family expectations, friendships, cultural norms, upbringing, and long-term conditioning. Rarely do they reflect on the fact that these ideologies are engineered to implant emotional realities within them, to simulate allegiance, trigger subconscious feelings, and suggest that one side is more of a saviour than the other. But we are our saviours. We are the ones responsible for creating what makes life feel good, meaningful, and whole. An example, in the 19th century, America, enslaved people who ran away were said to suffer from dratomania, a supposed mental illness, a reminder that sanity has often been used to maintain control, not uncover the truth. Notable thinkers, proponents who echo similar ideas. George Orwell critiqued the manipulation of truth and language in service of ideology conformity in 1984's book. Noam Chomsky explored how media and political institutions manufacture consent and polarization. Michel Foucault analysed how systems of power shape what is accepted as truth, including mental health and politics. Jiddu Krishnamurti warned of the dangers of ideological allegiance, stating, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." Ed Bernays, the father of public relations, demonstrated how emotional conditioning and propaganda shape belief systems. John Taylor Gatto argued that education and upbringing are forms of social programming, pushing individuals into ideological roles. And finally, Carl Jung emphasized the danger of mass psychosis and ideological possession when individuals lose their inner compass. References: Michael Foucault's Madness and Civilization, an exploration of how madness has been constructed and marginalized through Western history. Thomas Saz's The Myth of Mental Illness challenges psychiatry's foundation as a neutral science. And an experiment that was carried out, the Rosenhan experiment in 1973. Psychologist David Rosenhan and associates feigned hallucinations to be admitted into psychiatric hospitals, and once they were admitted, they behaved normally, yet were kept for days or weeks and diagnosed with severe disorders. The experiment revealed how psychiatric labels can be sticky and subjective. Suggested reading and viewing. The Divided Self by R.D. Lane explores existential approaches to psychosis, and the documentary Crazy Wise explores spiritual awakenings mistaken for mental illness. Cracks in the mirror self-reflection activity. Let's pause for a moment. I often provide lots of information, but now I'm going to give you a chance to directly engage with this episode. Sit in front of a mirror. Ask yourself, whose reflection am I seeing? Your own? Are you wearing a branded item, e.g. a t-shirt maybe with Nike or any labelling? Ask yourself, what influenced you to buy it? Did you like the association with Nike? Was it a quality-made top in your favourite colour? Or did you buy it because a friend wears similar? Cultures. Do you wear a head turban? Do you have dreadlocks or wear a cross? Your parents. Do you see qualities of your parents within you? Influence behaviours learned from others? The algorithm. Did you find this video as a reflection of your previous viewing by accident or suggestions from your content provider, or consciously searching for material on such subjects? With these considerations in mind, and if you need to write them down, ask yourself why, for what reason, did I truly consciously choose for myself? The more you consider these points and align with your true wants, desires and needs, the closer you take a step to being your true authentic self, knowing for yourself and acting by yourself, free from influence of others. Self-reflection activity continued, and conclusion. Write down 5 thoughts or feelings you've had that you've never shared. Ask, would I be called crazy for these? Or are they simply unspoken truths? Cracks in the mirror don't only distort, they reveal. They expose hidden layers, alternative perceptions, and uncomfortable truths. The fragmentation we fear, may be our escape from confinement. This episode begins where perception fractures at the place where society tells us not to look. Additional reflections on the mirror. Consider this. The mirror does not simply reflect light, it reflects identity. When you look into it, you are not just seeing your face, you are witnessing your history, your programming, your unresolved feelings. What does the mirror hide behind the familiarity of your reflection? Ask yourself, do I recognise who's looking back at me, or have I constructed that image to meet others' expectations? What labels have I internalised about what it means to be sane? Where did they come from? How often do I silence my thoughts, not because they're irrational, but because they're inconvenient or uncomfortable for others? For some, the mirror may appear friendly and familiar. For others, it's a battleground, where fragments of identity clash, where trauma reappears. What happens if you stop seeking a singular image and instead allow the mirror to show multiplicity? After the earlier self-reflection, return to the mirror in dim lighting. Observe your face without trying to interpret it. Notice what thoughts arise without judgment. Can you hold space for everything that surfaces without editing it? Conclusion. The cracked mirror is not a symbol of brokenness. It is an invitation to see differently, to question what we've been taught to call mad, to trace the outlines in truth in places where others see only distortion. This episode is for those who have glimpsed something strange in their reflection and dare to look closer. Section 2. Sanity as a social construct. Sanity is not a universal constant. It is a social agreement reinforced by systems of authority. What we define as rational or normal is shaped by political convenience, cultural tradition, and institutional control. It often reflects the values of dominant class, not an objective truth about the human mind. We previously defined sanity as a condition of being judged mentally sound or rational, typically determined by conformity to prevailing norms of thought and behaviour. But whose norms? And why do they matter? Throughout history, societies have framed dissent, deviance, and emotional intensity as a form of madness. Women were once institutionalised for expressing dissatisfaction, branded with female hysteria, a diagnosis rooted not in science, but in patriarchal fear. Soldiers suffering from trauma of trench warfare were told they had shell shock, later renamed, pathologised, and medicalised to reframe their suffering as weakness. Historical examples of labelled dissent. During the Cold War, the CIA popularised the term conspiracy theorist in 1967 via Dispatch 1035-960 to discredit critics of the Warren Commission, conflating dissent with delusion. Galileo was persecuted for challenging church cosmology. His insights were considered dangerous, and thus he was deemed mad by religious orthodoxy. John Forbes Nash, mathematician and Nobel laureate, was institutionalised for schizophrenia, yet his visionary insights revolutionised game theory. Asylums, authority, and the weaponisation of care. The history of psychiatric asylums in both the UK and US reveals a legacy not of healing, but of control. In the 19th and 20th centuries, institutionalizations often served as social dumping grounds for the poor, the rebellious, or the non-conforming. Treatments ranged from dehumanizing to outright torturous. Lobotomies developed by Antonio Egas Moniz and later popularized in the US by Walter Freeman involved severing the brain's frontal lobes to calm patients, leaving many of them in a vegetative state. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, still used today, was once administered without anesthesia or consent, inducing violent seizures and memory loss. Chemical restraints and isolation were routine, not to heal, but to silence. And one such example was Alan Turing, who was perceived as heterosexual. They chemically restrained him and castrated him. It's absolutely abhorrent. These acts were often justified by a single, fallible professional's judgment. In the UK today, concerns persist under the Mental Health Act, which allows for the detention of individuals for 28 days under Section 2. Recent proposals suggest this could be actioned based on the authority of just one professional. This reduction in oversight is not just clinical, it is political. With fewer checks, the likelihood of abuse increases. To grant one person unilateral power to define another's reality is a dangerous precedent. Two opinions once offered a minimum of balance. One is tyranny by professional decree. The persecution of the spiritual and the collapse of trust in authority. Spiritual individuals have long borne the brunt of institutional fear and suppression, from mystics and healers to witches and visionaries. Those who claim direct connection to unseen truths were often seen as threats to the established power. The Salem witch trials, 1692 to 1693, led to the execution of 20 individuals, mostly women accused of witchcraft by a community inflamed with fear and religious fervour. These women were spiritual, herbalists, midwives, individuals deeply attuned to their environment. Medieval inquisitions in Europe targeted Gnostics, Cathars, and other mystic groups, many of whom spoke of divine knowledge that bypassed church hierarchy. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, not merely for her military command, but for claiming divine voices, a threat to the clerical monopoly on God. These weren't acts of moral clarity, they were attempts to extinguish personal revelation and replace it with obedience. Philosophical perspective. Hannah Arendt warned of the banality of evil, how ordinary people, following rules without question, can become agents of tyranny. Ivan Illich critiqued institutionalized religion and medicine as a system that sever our relationship with intuition and inner wisdom. Spiritual perspective. Many indigenous cultures see madness and spiritual visions not as illness, but as initiation. Shamans are often chosen because of their ability to perceive beyond the consensus reality. The mystic traditions of Sufism, Kabbalah, and Taoism honor direct experience of the divine, an act often punished when it threatened orthodoxy. We must ask, if spiritual madness is feared by the system, perhaps it's because it offers an ungovernable form of liberation. Why is authority trusted so blindly? Society conditions us to associate qualifications with morality, but a certificate proves knowledge, not ethics or morals. This headline picture to the right questions the morals and ethics of the latest pope. Disgusting behaviour from a false idol, in my opinion. The headline reads, Pope Leo looked the other way when confronted with child sex abuse allegations against priest in his Chicago church. Institutional authority grants status and trust, often unearned. Abusers thrive in trusted roles, clergy, doctors, therapists. Implied trust gives predators access and protection. Contemporary echoes and re-education. In China, so-called re-education camps are used to silence Uyghurs, Falun Gong practitioners and dissenters, subjecting them to psychological manipulation, forced confessions, and ideological indoctrination. In the UK, a recent publication suggested conspiracy theorists could be reprogrammed, an open admission that behavioural conditioning is in use every day in the UK. Conclusion to sanity as a social construct. Relevant sources. The Protest Psychosis by Jonathan Metzl, How Schizophrenia Was Racialized to Suppress Black Activism. Peter Bregin's work on psychiatric abuse, toxic psychiatry. And finally, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reports on China's re-education camps. Sanity is not simply a measure of health, it is a mechanism of compliance. It tells us what to think, how to feel, and who is safe to trust. When we question it, we open the possibility that the world we've accepted as reality is more fragile, and more manipulated than we ever dared to admit. Section 3. The Madness of the Visionary. History tells us that those who see differently are rarely seen clearly. Visionaries are often misread by their contemporaries, not because their insights are flawed, but because their perceptions surpass accepted limits. What society calls madness may in fact clarity beyond convention. Van Gogh, Tesla are told, Joan of Arc, revered or ridiculed depending on the century. They perceived more, felt more, saw what others could not. Their altered states, whether spiritual, neurodivergent, or intuitive, offered access points to deeper truths. Additional examples, Philip K. Dick claimed to have received transmissions from a divine intelligence and predicted future political events decades ahead. William Blake spoke with angels and saw spiritual realms that became the basis of his art and poetry. Nietzsche, once institutionalized, laid the groundwork for existentialism and postmodernism. Carl Jung's Red Book recorded a decade of intense visions, which became the symbolic foundation of analytical psychology. Let's look deeper at Philip K. Dick and Nietzsche. Philip K. Dick, born 1928 to 1982, was an American science fiction writer known for exploring reality, identity, and altered states of consciousness. His most famous works include Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which inspired Blade Runner the movie, and A Scanner Darkly. Philip K. Dick often wrote from a place of deep psychological and philosophical inquiry, including personal experiences with hallucinations, prophetic dreams, and what he believed were divine transmissions. His themes of surveillance, simulated realities, and shifting identities resonated with readers and became increasingly relevant in the digital age. To the established powers, Dick's narratives were unsettling, painting a future where institutions manipulate perception, memory, and morality itself. The madness of the visionary continued. Friedrich Nietzsche, born 1844 and died in 1900, was a German philosopher who challenged the foundations of religion, morality, and culture. His works, including Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and The Genealogy of Morals, introduced concepts like will to power, the Übermensch, and the infamous declaration that God is dead. Nietzsche's ideas were radical for their time, promoting a philosophy of personal transcendence beyond herd morality. His mental collapse later in life led to his institutionalization, often cited as a tragic end to a man considered mad by many contemporaries, but revolutionary in retrospect. His work deeply challenged ecclesiastical authority and Enlightenment rationalism, marking him as a philosophical visionary feared by many institutions. The scientific context of madness. Research by Robin Carhart-Harris, Imperial College London, on psychedelics shows that visionary states correlate with reduced activity in a default mode network, DMN area of the brain, which otherwise maintain ego-bound rationality. High openness to experience, a big five personality trait, strongly correlates with creative potential and visionary perception, sometimes misunderstood as instability. Spiritual frameworks. In shamanic cultures, spiritual madness is a rite of passage. The shaman becomes the bridge between worlds because they have walked through inner chaos and returned. Prophets, mystics, and enlightened beings across traditions, Buddha, Muhammad, Teresa of Avila, and often experience prolonged altered states, dreams, or divine revelations. Philosophical reflections. Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions remind us that paradigm shifters are always dismissed as irrational until the paradigm changes. Alan Watts remarked that the mystic swims in the same ocean where the psychotic drowns. The difference is, one has learned how to navigate. Self-reflection, self-inquiry, and creative exercise. Recall a time you had a powerful dream, gut instinct, or a flash of insight. Write it down. Did you accept it? Or did others accept it? Try sketching or writing an experience you couldn't explain logically. See what emerges when you express it symbolically. From my own personal experience of spiritual awakening, at first I thought I was losing my mind. It wasn't until I self-reflected, carried out some research to explain it to myself, the act of acquiring the knowledge not only expanded my consciousness, it expanded my awareness, which has been a wholly fulfilling experience. My thoughts, feelings, and beliefs on religion or politics are insignificant, irrelevant, as I see them as structures of control they are. I fight for my own soul, I care for my fellow souls, and encourage them to see for themselves. The most powerful thing you can do is control yourself. Understand your subconscious. That's the true holy grail, not a golden cup. You only have this moment, the present. Breathe in, breathe out, and do not live in fear of others telling you what to think or feel. Further reading and references. The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, a foundational exploration of altered consciousness and visionary insight. The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Szasz challenges psychiatry's categorization of spiritual or creative states. The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes, a radical theory on how visionary voices shaped early human cognition. Madness and Modernism by Louis Szasz, a psychological and aesthetic reading of visionary experiences in literature and art. Visionary Creativity by Tammy Simon, Sounds True podcast series. Conversations with artists, mystics, and psychologists about creative madness. Conclusion to Section 3, Madness of the Visionary. The visionary mind is not a defect, it is a divergence, a deviation from the norm that reveals what the norm dares not to examine. What society calls madness may often be the first glimmers of a paradigm shift, a message too disruptive to be easily understood. When we deny or pathologize visionary insight, we not only silence individuals, we delay evolution. To see beyond is not madness, it is the first step towards renewal. But this insight comes risk. Those who challenge entrenched narratives risk marginalization, exile, or worse, and yet history has shown us that from those margins come the minds that move mountains. As we transition into the next section, we will explore what happens when these divergences in perception are medicalized, labeled, and contained, when neurological differences such as autism, ADHD, and bipolarity, schizophrenia, are no longer a bridge to deeper meaning, but a justification for exclusion. Section 4. Neurodivergence versus pathology. Neurodivergence is not a flaw, it's a variation, a different wiring of the mind, not a broken one. Conditions like autism, ADHD, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia are often presented as abnormalities to be corrected, when in truth, they may represent the outer edges of human cognitive diversity. From personal experience, I was diagnosed from autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and bipolar type 2 at the age of 35. I'm now 45. After I looked into it because of one of my children being diagnosed, and the difficulties I had from childhood, and feeling different to others. I now believe these diagnoses are just human conditions, to demonize and categorize people, to cause division. I am just hyper-aware of my body, surroundings, and those of others. These diagnoses do not define me, they describe ways my mind processes the world. They describe the heightened sensitivity, known as my intuition. I realized I feel the energy of others as well as my own, an intensity of thought and feeling, a divergence from linear norms, but they are not defects, they are facets of a broader human condition. Growing up, I was talked down to, disrespected, and excluded, dismissed, bullied, not taken serious. Not for who I was, but for being different to others, and those individuals projected their insecurities and ego on me. I was always humble, but people would go out their way to make me feel bad. I often felt I couldn't be myself. Therefore I become shy and meek at times, and would not always speak out, because you can only tolerate staying silent for so long. Often when I did speak out, people would make me feel what I was contributing wasn't worth listening to, so I would get emotional and have outbursts of frustration and anger, which led to people to project me in a bad light. I really struggled to communicate with rationale because I couldn't explain what and how I was being made to feel. As I grew older, I realised I was surrounding myself with users, people who wanted to take advantage of my kind, caring nature. I would be there for them, but they could never be there for me when I needed care, love and support. At times I was surrounded by the most disgusting of people. I look back and can't believe I even allowed them in my space. But unfortunately that's a lesson of when you chase love and do not show yourself love. And when I stood up to them because I became tired of the dismissal, being spoken down to as if I didn't matter, they did their best to deflect their actions and behaviours back onto me, because they could not accept their own flaws, take responsibility or account for their own selfish actions, and always having to be right, egotistical, everything was a point to prove. These people didn't like themselves, so they felt they had the right to treat others bad. People refused to get to know the real me. They treated me with preconceived images they had of me in their minds. Some judged the diagnosis, not the person when I was eventually diagnosed. Even in childhood, I spoke truths that made others uncomfortable. I saw through the illusions of government, of hypocrisy, of false authority, and for that I was shunned. I silenced myself over the years, which diminished my outer confidence and shattered my inner confidence, and I displayed traits of those who projected on me to others. I felt at times I had become not a very nice person, but I overcome it, as I did the work to understand the labels, others' behaviours, the reasons why they and I behaved in such a way under certain conditions. I was able to communicate more effectively how I was being affected. And even then, people treated me without any value, so I cut them out of my life for good, to validate myself and to love myself more. Now I feel more confident, happy and secure within myself. I accept myself for who I am, what I do, what I think and feel, and I feel I can connect better with others because of it when I get the opportunity. I have become less reactive and more responsive, pensive, and only give my time and energy to people who reciprocate, support and show they stand with me. There are too many hidden enemies who will call you their friend, but when you look at their actions, analyse how they speak to you, and become conscious of how you feel in the moment and their presence, you realise they aren't there for you. They are only there for what they can get out of you. It baffles me still how clearly I can see through the contradictions, yet others remain blind, obedient, compliant to systems that serve no one but themselves. However, because of my own journey, investigations, research and study, I can understand why the world is the way it is. Despite all that, I have always refused to limit myself even in the darkest of moments. I strive to improve, to grow and to give back and be a loving, caring individual. Because when you see the world differently, it can be a lonely place, but it can also be a source of deep compassion and strength. Cultural contrast. In Western medicine, neurodivergent behaviours are pathologized when they deviate from norms of productivity, compliance, or predictability. But in other cultures, those same traits are valued. Shamans, oracles, spirit talkers, these roles often belong to those whose perception deviates from the everyday. Scientific perspective. Research shows autistic and ADHD brains demonstrate different patterns of connectivity and heightened sensitivity to input, traits that can enhance creativity, perception, and empathy. Bipolar mood states correlates with increased activity in brain regions tied to emotion and narration integration, fuel for art, insight, and innovation. Perception spectrum model, linear versus lateral thinkers. Overview. This model visualizes the spectrum of cognitive processing styles across two general poles. Linear thinkers tend to process information in step-by-step cause and effect, goal-orientated fashion. This is a dominant style favored in institutional settings, e.g. schools and corporations. Lateral thinkers navigate the world associatively, intuitively, emotionally, or symbolically. These thinkers often leap between ideas, notice patterns others miss, and express creativity non-linearly. Neither is superior. Both styles have strength, but modern society disproportionately values linearity, often pathologizing lateral traits as disorganized, impulsive, or irrational. Why this matters in the Inversiverse. The Inversiverse, reality is decoded not just through logic, but through paradox, emotion, and symbolism. Lateral thinkers live closest to this edge of perception, making them more likely to see through illusions, but also more likely to be labelled mad. Expanded considerations. The myth of functionality. In modern systems, functionality is a covert measure of obedience, how well one fits into mechanized routines, social roles, and economic productivity. Those who think, feel, or act outside these expectations are seen as malfunctioning. But what if functionality were defined by one's ability to remain true to their essence while navigating an unjust world? The double empathy problem. Dr. Damien Milton. Communication difficulties between autistic and non-autistic people are often mutual. The issue isn't a lack of empathy in neurodivergent individuals, but a societal blind spot in recognizing how different perceptual languages collide. Masking and trauma. Neurodivergent individuals frequently mask their behaviors to survive in a neurotypical world. This prolonged effort leads to burnout, disassociation, and psychological trauma. The act of hiding one's authentic self is not adaptation, it's erasure. The world creates an illusion of being individual, inspires you to think outside the box, but as soon as you do, there's a rush to suppress you. Spiritual reframing. Consider neurodivergence as soul variation, a tuning of consciousness that opens the individual to subtle realities, truth beneath the illusions, or intuitive sight. Judith Orloff's work on empaths and Thomas Armstrong's neurodiversity advocacy both emphasizes the soulfulness of sensitivity. Historical erasure and reclamation. Figures like Alan Turing, likely autistic, Emily Dickinson, speculated to be neurodivergent, and even Ludwig van Beethoven, potentially bipolar disorder, pictured to the right, were pathologized or misunderstood in their time. Their voices were often diminished by societal discomfort with difference. Conclusion to Section 4, Neurodivergence versus Pathology. The labels may linger, but they don't define us. What matters is not the diagnosis, but the understanding. And in that space, between perception and judgment, we reclaim the power to define ourselves from political and cultural weaponization of sanity. Dissidents in the USSR diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia. Feminism dismissed as hysteria. African spiritual practices labelled delusional by missionaries are such examples. Further reading and research. The Empath Survival Guide by Judith Orloff explores high sensitivity and intuition as strengths. Neurotribes by Steve Silberman is a comprehensive history of autism and neurodivergence. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk on trauma, masking, and the embodied mind. The Divergent Mind by Jenara Narenberg, an exploration of women, neurodivergence, and misdiagnosis. And finally, Unmasking Autism by Devon Price examines autistic masking and offers frameworks for authenticity. Self-reflection activity for neurotypical audiences. Before we move on to the next section, let's pause for a moment if you want to engage in the exercise. Spend 1 hour in silence without your phone or external stimulation. Write down your thoughts without filtering. Then read a page of dense poetic or abstract text like Blake, Nietzsche, or metaphysical philosophy. How does your mind react? Are you uncomfortable, curious, frustrated? Imagine this heightened state as your constant baseline. That's how many neurodivergent people experience everyday life, layered, intense, and non-linear. Section 5. Madness as Initiation and Spiritual Emergency. Not all madness is a malfunction. In many spiritual traditions, madness is the beginning of awakening. It is a rupture of ordinary consciousness that precedes rebirth. Western psychiatry may pathologize these states, but ancient and indigenous cultures often honored them as sacred transitions. Psychological and spiritual frames. Carl Jung viewed the individuation process, the integration of shadow and unconscious material, as a spiritual journey that can mimic madness. He once wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." Stanislav Grof coined the term spiritual emergency to describe intense psychological crises that contain transformative potential, often mistaken for psychosis. In shamanic traditions, initiates are often called through a breakdown, an inner death, or an encounter with visions that separate them from ordinary reality. These states are embraced, not suppressed. My personal reflection: I've walked through this fire. There have been many moments in my life when I felt like reality itself was collapsing around me, emotions uncontained, symbols flooding my mind, an unbearable intensity in my heart. Doctors called it bipolarity, autism, ADHD. But in those moments, I also touched something divine, a deeper truth, a knowing, a breaking of boundaries between self and the cosmos. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't meaningless either. Where society saw madness or illness, I found initiation. The cycle is ego death, symbolic death, rebirth, and reintegration. So let's look at them each. Ego death is the collapse of the constructed identity and belief systems. Symbolic death is a retreat inwards, a descent into the underworld of one's psyche. Rebirth is a moment of insight, breakthrough, or clarity emerging from the chaos. And reintegration is the return to society, carrying wisdom, scars, and truth. Cultural parallels include the Dark Night of the Soul. St. John of the Cross mirrors this process, a soul suffering before divine union. In African tribes, rites of passage across Africa, South America, and Australia often include isolation, fasting, and altered states that mimic what psychiatry might label as hallucination. The sacred trickster and archetypal chaos. In mythology, figures like Hermes, Coyote, and Loki represent sacred madness, disruptive yet revelatory. They dismantle illusion and ego through chaos, often leading others to uncomfortable truths. Joseph Campbell called this crossing the threshold, the first step into transformation. The problem of premature pathologizing. Modern psychiatry often medicalizes awakening before it can unfold. Instead of meaning-making, we offer sedation. Instead of mentorship, we offer medication. When someone is navigating symbolic death, they need spiritual midwifery, not just diagnosis. Narrative is a healing. Writing, speaking, and reclaiming one's madness through narratives reframes suffering as a story. It restores agency. Madness narrated becomes meaning, madness unspoken becomes trauma. Neuropsychological research. Studies show overlapping neural activity between mystical states, via medication or psychedelics, and some forms of psychosis. What differentiates a spiritual emergency from a breakdown is often the environment, support, and framing, not neurology. In the chaos of my worst breakdown, I felt both horror and awe. My mind was unraveling, but something deeper was breaking through. The sense that this pain had a purpose, that the walls I had built to survive were now crumbling, so I could breathe. Take a moment to pause. Self-inquiry exercise. Reflect on a time in your life when everything fell apart. Did something shift within you afterwards? What part of yourself died, and what part awakened? If you've never experienced this, ask yourself, what parts of my identity am I most afraid to let go of? If madness is a message, what is your soul trying to tell you when everything begins to break? The journey through inner chaos, what we often call madness, is not merely a descent into dysfunction. For many, it is spiritual initiation, a necessary breaking away from illusions, a reckoning with the soul's deeper truth. My own experience have taught me that what others call a breakdown may be a breakthrough, a disintegration of what no longer serves, making space for something more authentic to emerge. But what happens when you return from that inner descent, and the world you return to still insists on its illusions? What if your healing is perceived as madness simply because it does not comply with convention? That leads us to the next question. What if madness is not just internal, but a mirror held up to the world itself? What if the systems we live in, the institutions, the ideologies, the culture of suppression are themselves the source of madness? Section 6. Madness in a mad world. When the world itself is irrational, to be well adjusted is not sanity, it is complicity. The question no longer is, are you sane? But is the world you're adapting to worth being sane in? In a society riddled with contradictions, disconnection, ecological collapse, and chronic stress, who is truly healthy? Who is truly well? Gabor Mate asks, what if the diagnosis is not in the person, but in the culture that shaped them? The sanity of dissent. In a world that rewards obedience over awareness, emotional suppression over authenticity, and conformity over courage, madness may be a form of protest. Depression, anxiety, and disassociation may not be symptoms of individual failure, but reflections of systemic dysfunction. When children are raised in emotionally barren environments, taught to ignore their intuition, and forced into rigid identities, they learn to survive by shutting down parts of themselves. What if those shutdowns are not flaws, but the cost of survival, I ask? My reflection, sanity on the edge. There have been countless times I've looked around at the world. its double standards, its violence dressed as order, its spiritual emptiness, and wondered how anyone could not see it. How could they call this structure normal? How they could cheer for madness as long as it was nicely dressed and state-sanctioned. I've seen how people reward each other for compliance and mock those who feel too much, speak too deeply, or question too openly. I felt alien in rooms full of smiles because I couldn't lie to myself. The madness wasn't inside me. It was the world asking me to pretend. Defining paradox and societal paradox. A paradox is a statement or situation that appears self-contradictory or illogical but may contain an underlying truth. It challenges linear thinking by exposing how opposites can coexist in tension, or how expected norms unravel under scrutiny. Societal paradox occurs when collective norms or systems promote contradictory values, behaviours, or expectations, especially those that harm or invalidate individual well-being while being upheld as necessary or virtuous by the culture at large. Examples of societal paradoxes. Workaholism is praised. Rest is viewed as laziness. Productivity is valued, but burnout is rampant. Conformity is rewarded. Authenticity is feared. Be yourself, unless it's inconvenient. Emotional numbness is professionalism. Emotional expression is weakness. People are told to share their truth, but penalised for doing so. Mental illness is stigmatised, yet society fosters it. Environments that breed anxiety, trauma, and despair label those affected as disordered. These paradoxes reveal how societies often manufacture the very conditions they then condemn. They generate psychological distress, and then shame those who express it. The mask of wellness. Today, wellness has become its own performance. Self-care routines without self-awareness, aesthetic spirituality, and pharmaceutical sedation as a proxy for healing. Madness isn't just suppressed, it's commercialised, pacified, and turned into marketing. But real madness, unfiltered awareness, is too unpredictable to be commodified. That's why it's still feared. Self-reflection questions. What does it mean to be well in a sick world? Have you ever been told to calm down when you were speaking the truth? What parts of yourself have you muted to be seen as sane? Suggested further study and research. Psychiatry and the Human Condition by Thomas Saz expands on the political use of psychiatry in modern society. The Politics of Experience by R.D. Lane explores how so-called mental illness can reflect deeper existential truths. Insane Society, A Sociology of Mental Health by Peter Morale discusses how societal constructs determine definitions of insanity. Pathologizing Normality, Critical Reflections on the DSM, edited by Craig Nunes, a critique of diagnostic overreach and systemic bias in mental health. And finally, The Book of Symbols by Aras and Tashin, for those wishing to explore inner chaos and meaning-making through universal archetypes. Self-reflection activity. If you wish to engage, pause now. Walking the edge. 1. Find a quiet space and sit with a journal. 2. Reflect on time you felt alien or outcast for telling the truth and write it down. What you said or did, how others responded, what did you feel inside? 3. Now reverse the lens. Think of a time someone else challenged your worldview. How did you respond? 4. Consider what if madness is simply a refusal to pretend. What does that reveal about the society I live in? And 5. Draw or map a line between what you feel and what you show. Where do they split and why? Let this space be where paradox, pain, and clarity can coexist. Conclusion to madness in a mad world. Perhaps madness is not an illness, but a form of truth-telling. A kind of unbearable honesty. If that's the case, then maybe we need more madness in this world, not less. From my personal experience, I've come to recognise that what others saw as instability was often my deepest intuition speaking. When I spoke against hypocrisy, people called me difficult. When I questioned systems, they called me paranoid. I learned early that truth makes people uncomfortable, and those who point out contradictions often become scapegoats. Patterns emerged: social withdrawal after emotional expression, shame for being sensitive, disbelief when I spoke about injustice. These weren't mental health crises. They were reactions to a world that demanded silence, obedience, and numbness. I was told to manage myself, but I chose instead to understand myself. To overcome, I returned to core practices: radical self-reflection, writing, movement, art, and a connection with people who saw me, really saw me. I found power in naming my experiences, in trusting my inner voice, in refusing to play along with a system that defined sanity as submission. This wasn't just personal healing, it was political, it was spiritual, and it was necessary. So if you're someone who has been labelled, dismissed, or feared for thinking differently, know this: your madness might be the map, your divergence might be the key, and your story might be the light someone else is waiting to find. Let us not conform to survive, let us transform so others may awaken. Section 7. Towards Conscious Sanity. What if sanity isn't about stability, but flexibility? What if healing doesn't mean returning to normal, but discovering who you were before the world told you who to be, and forging a new path of your own? Conscious liberation. True sanity may not be found in compliance, but in conscious awareness. It's not a checklist of behaviours that make you acceptable. It's a commitment to knowing yourself, questioning illusions, and finding alignment with deeper truths. Conscious sanity is a living process, not a label. Reclaiming sanity from inside out. In a world that profits from insecurity and control, conscious sanity is an act of rebellion. It means breaking the loop of external validation and internalized oppression. It means saying, I will not shrink myself to fit into a sick system. This has been my work, unlearning the belief that I am broken because I feel deeply, rebuilding trust in my own mind after years of dismissal. For me, conscious sanity began when I stopped asking, what's wrong with me, and started asking, what happened to me, and what do I truly know to be real, regardless of how others react. Practices for conscious sanity. Breathwork and somatic awareness. returning to the body to regulate and ground. Narrative reclamation, rewriting your story in your own words, not through diagnosis or trauma scripts. Radical honesty, telling the truth even if your voice shakes. Discernment, asking if this belief is mine or was it planted in me. Spiritual integration, holding space for intuition, synchronicity, and mystery without shame. My path towards conscious sanity. There were times I doubted everything, especially myself. But through presence, support, and inner work, I learned that clarity isn't found in silence. It is in listening deeply to what never stopped speaking beneath the noise. My sanity was not lost. It was buried under the expectation of others. I discovered that when I honoured what once I feared in myself, emotions, intuition, and vision, I became more whole, not less, and the more I embraced my rhythm, the less the world's judgment could bind me to it. There's been a lot of information presented in this episode, which may have left you feeling tired, but let's not end here. Take a moment to pause and reflect on all that has been presented. Does it resonate with you? If you care to, let's do another activity before concluding this section. Self-reflection activity, mapping your inner compass. 1. Write down 5 beliefs you inherited about what it means to be sane, strong, or successful. 2. Then write your lived experiences of those. Do you believe those beliefs hold truth? Circle the ones you've outgrown and write new beliefs that reflect your current truth. 4. Finally, describe what sanity would feel like if you defined it yourself. How would your day look? What would you stop doing? Section 8. The Myth of Normalcy. What if normal was never a truth, but a consensus illusion? A line drawn in sand by those in power to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Normalcy is not a fixed reality. It is a cultural performance, a set of rules whispered to us through institutions, media, and family expectations. It is statistical at best, oppressive at worst. The problem is not that some of us are different. The problem is that sameness is treated as the goal. Defining normal and the myth behind it. Normal is an adjective, conforming to a standard, usual, typical, or an expected. But whose standards? Expected by whom? When did typical become the benchmark for human validity? In medicine, normal is often defined statistically, yet statistical averages do not define health or wholeness. In society, normal is defined by what causes the least disruption, yet disruption is often where truth and progress reside. The myth. Normal is natural, normal is safe, normal is healthy. The actual reality is, normal is constructed, it is enforced, it is used as a border wall to separate those who belong from those who challenge the narrative. My personal experience with normal. I've never felt normal. I refuse to refer to myself as normal. I am unique. I live in integrity the best I can, authenticity, from the heart and conscious thought towards others and myself. I never felt normal in school. At times I was considered slow and required extra attention in early years to help progress my reading and writing. And probably because my concentration span was shot, probably at set and trying to just be accepted. In emotional states, the logical mind tunes out through the autonomic nervous system. That's why many have concentration issues, not because the individual doesn't try hard enough, which is another fallacy of a controlling system. I do not feel normal conversation. It's made up word and concept as another tool by proxy to triangulate and police ourselves, to make reference to, oh, that person isn't normal because they are unique to themselves. It's literal insanity. Nobody is normal. There never will be a normal person. There never was a normal reference to begin with. I've never felt normal in systems that asked me to erase my instincts just to fit in. I've been labelled, marginalised, misunderstood because I didn't behave in the ways people were comfortable with. I don't misbehave, lie or manipulate people. I just refuse to engage in small talk, pointless crap, argue about divisional topics, because that's the intent. But what I see now is that the discomfort wasn't about me. It was about their idea of normal being too fragile to hold difference. I've watched others twist themselves into painful shapes just to be liked. I've done it myself, until I realised chasing normal is the fastest way to abandon who you truly are. Social enforcement of the normal ideal. In education, creative thinkers are diagnosed as disruptive. In mental health, people pathologise for emotional depth or intensity. In media, homogenetically celebrated. Diversity of the mind and expression muted. In everyday life, politeness preferred over honesty, masks over realness. The normal personality is often just the most predictable, not the most whole. Suggested further study and research. The End of Normal by Leonard J. Davis. A critical look at how society defines and enforces normalcy. Neurodiversity, discovering the extraordinary gifts of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other brain differences by Thomas Armstrong. Against Normalization, writing Radical Democracy in South Africa and the United States by Anthony O'Brien, explores political implications of normalization. Abnormal, lectures at Collège de France by Michel Foucault, an examination of how norms are used to discipline and exclude. And finally, Extraordinary Bodies by Rosemarie Garland Thomason, on disability, difference, and social construction of normal embodiment. We're coming to the end of the episode. But before we go, if you care to join in, please pause now to complete the activity. Self-reflection activity. Dismantling normal. 1. List 5 things you've done in your life to appear to be normal. 2. Next to each one, write what you felt you had to hide to achieve that. 3. Ask yourself, who benefits when I suppress this part of me? 4. Reflect on one abnormal trait you possess. How might it actually be a strength? 5. Journal a vision of a world where no one has to apologise for being outside the average. Conclusion to the myth of normalcy. To be normal is to be invisible. But the world does not need more invisibility. It needs depth, colour, honesty, and disruption. The myth of normalcy has wounded millions who grew up believing their difference was a problem to fix, rather than a brilliance to unfold. My own journey has taught me that normal is not the baseline of truth. It is shrinking space, a husk, and beyond it lies a field of reality, more expansive, more compassionate, and far more alive than anything normal could offer. So let's conclude. The myth of sanity, madness, genius, and the edge of perception. We were never meant to be normal. We were meant to be whole, to feel, to sense, to question, to create, to challenge illusion and embody truth, even when that truth makes others uncomfortable. Throughout this episode, we've peeled back layers of illusion, from medicalization of perception, to the policing of behavior, to the myth of normality itself. We've seen how madness is not failure, but insight rejected. We've explored how systems define sanity not to protect us, but to control and categorize what they don't understand. I have lived this. I have felt what it's like to be labelled before being known. Excluded for what I see, dismissed for how I feel. I spent years trying to decode a world that didn't make sense, and finally realised it's because the world isn't sane. But we can be, in our own way. Real sanity is not about fitting in, but waking up. It's radical, creative, messy and alive. It's the courage to be authentic in the face of pressure to conform. It's claiming your difference is sacred, not shameful. We are not here to be uniform, we are here to be unique. And in that uniqueness lies not only healing, but the future. The new world will not be built by those who followed rules, but by those who dare to rewrite new ones. Let the myth collapse, let the truth emerge, let us all be free. I'm James, and thanks for joining me today on the Inversiverse episode 14. Until next time, bye bye.